Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about Echoes of Vana'diel. For those of you who don't keep up with everything Final Fantasy XIV related, Echoes of Vana'diel is the name of the Alliance raid series for the next expansion, Dawn Trail. And if you're unfamiliar with the name, Echoes of Vana'diel is indeed going to be focused around their MMO senpai, as Yoshi P called it, Final Fantasy XI. Featuring all sorts of elements from those games, bosses, story elements, characters, whatever. It's Final Fantasy XI in Final Fantasy XIV, and not the Eureka kind this time around. So as someone who played Final Fantasy XI in its glory days, and still honestly dabbles now and again, even to the current day, I figured it was worth making a video on my thoughts on everything, you know, what I hope they do, some predictions or tinfoil hat theories, and also things I kind of hope they don't do. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive into Final Fantasy XI lore in this video. I'm actually going to save more broad explanations of the various expansions and reasons why I may or may not expect certain things in a different video, but I am still going to be referencing the various expansions and bosses in those expansions. So if you're someone who's planning on playing 11 and you don't want to know any sort of major details about the game's story or lore ahead of time, consider this your spoiler warning. And like I said, not story details, but boss names can be quite revealing in regards to the events that take place in these expansions, so this is my fair warning to you. So first of all, in terms of the story of Echoes of Vana'diel, we're kind of taking a shot in the dark. They said that the art that they used for Echoes of Vana'diel's initial reveal was part of the 20th anniversary, and thus it's not directly associated with the contents of the raid. We're going to be getting art specific to that sometime in the future. That being said, I do have some things I kind of hope they do and don't do. And my number one thing that I don't want to see them do is I don't want Vana'diel to just be another shard, or at least not in the way that people are thinking it will be. I mean, I've seen people for years try to say that Final Fantasy XI's world, not just like a version of Vana'diel or anything in that capacity, is just one of the shards across all of Hydaelyn, across all of the different worlds that we've come to know exist. And I've never liked that. I don't like it now. It just seems lazy, but not even that. I know the world and the story of Final Fantasy XI, and while it would take a brief explanation of the Wings of the Goddess expansion in particular to explain why Final Fantasy XI being a shard would quite frankly be one of the nuttier theories people could have, overall, to me, that just seems lazy. I think Final Fantasy XIV is at its best when it takes elements from the other games and makes them make sense within Final Fantasy XIV. I find that things like the Crystal Tower and Return to Ivalice, while super involved and in many cases ripped right from those worlds and games and universes, they're still placed within Final Fantasy XIV in a way that is explainable, in a way that isn't immersion breaking. And I really want that for this. So if they just say that Final Fantasy XI was a shard all along and they've just kind of coexisted, that to me is just not the way I want to see it go. Now that being said, I'm not saying Vana'diel can't be a shard. I just want it to be one that's built within Final Fantasy XIV's lore and story, not just Final Fantasy XI. I mean, it's not that far-fetched to imagine a shard might have some different history or lore for some of the things that we experience in the source, and thus it kind of makes sense as another one of those reflections that we've been dealing with. I mean, in Final Fantasy XI, their goddess is called Altana, and is it really that far-fetched to believe that maybe they know of a goddess, which would be Hydaelyn in their particular case, but that their culture has come to call them Altana? No, that's perfectly within reason. I wouldn't be surprised, but I just don't want it to, again, be that carbon copy with no sort of implications or anything of that sort across the actual world and lore of 14. Now, without that key art, I don't want to talk too much about particulars with the story, so instead I want to focus on bosses that I think will appear. And after going through the various expansions and the bosses that I would really feel are iconic to the franchise, there are a few I definitely expect to see, or are at least higher on my list, some that I don't expect to see, and some that I hope we don't see. So first of all, the early days of the game, including the base game and the Rise of Xylart and Chains of Promethea expansions, I think have the best spread of iconic bosses within the franchise, at least ones that they can incorporate without it being strange. I suppose. The Shadow Lord, the game's original final boss, to me is an absolute shoo-in. and I will be disappointed if Shadow Lord is not one of the bosses we encounter. But longtime Final Fantasy XI players will also point to the likes of the Archangels, Camlanot, and Ealdnark, again, all from the Xylart days, as well as the Chains of Promethea bosses, such as Promethea themselves. I know some people are kind of hoping that Absolute Virtue makes an appearance, and that there have been whispers from, I guess, people who spoke to devs and whatnot at FanFest that they would like to have another version of AV. But maybe I'm wrong for this, but I think Final Fantasy XI's current form of AV is the most loyal you could get to Absolute Virtue in an MMO, because it's built on those same like absolute, crazy theories that people had, except it's actually made manifest, and you go through that whole process of weakening it in the Baldesion Arsenal. And to me, that's such an honest interpretation of the way the community felt about that boss and the way that it was actually supposed to be fought to some level. Not entirely, because, that's a whole thing. You got to go watch my Absolute Virtue bestiary for that one. But I just think retreading Absolute Virtue again, In that same vein, jumping a little bit ahead, a lot of other people have pointed to the Pandemonium Warden, who I did indeed predict would be some form of boss in Pandemonium itself. Instead, we actually got Pandemonium itself and all those special cells to go with it. But I think they'll actively avoid Pandemonium Warden, because Pandemonium Warden was the worst press that Final Fantasy XI ever had. While Absolute Virtue had a really bad rap when it came to the way the actual community felt about it, Pandemonium Warden was where I saw articles being written on Yahoo and all sorts of other sites about people passing out and throwing up from trying to fight the boss for 18 hours straight, and that was indeed what forced them to make changes to Absolute Virtue and Pandemonium Warden. So I think they don't want to retread on all of that history just to make a reference to another notorious boss in the game. And then, honestly, I look across the rest of the expansions, and the boss references get a lot tougher after that. Like I said, I did the spoiler warning earlier, but Treasures of Otter Gone is largely an Odin and Alexander thing. Not to say there couldn't be other interpretations of them. That's always an option. I'm not going to be arrogant here and say that can't happen, but just not something I think is really a good idea. And then they also have other bosses from Wings of the Goddess. Lilith, actually a pretty cool boss, and I think they could make a pretty good story around Lilith and who she is. But I don't think that's a route they're going to take, especially with the shenanigans that came with Wings of the Goddess. You have the Abyssian, all the side story stuff, and I really don't think they'll use any of the add-on scenarios. And then you also have Hades in Seekers of Adulin. You have the Cloud of Darkness in Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, and Voracious, the most recent one, has Chaos. So it's like all of those bosses are like some interpretation of something that we've already seen in Final Fantasy XIV, or is just, in my opinion, not as iconic of an option as some of those original ones I named. I do think there are other bosses they could look at in some of those eras that may be worth pulling over, and some they actually already have. But I really think they're going to be looking towards those early days of Final Fantasy XI for boss inspirations. Now, I do have a crackpot theory, one of those shot in the dark. I've got no context. There's no reason for me to believe this. And honestly, it'll only be good if it's actually written well, all that stuff. I think the final boss of Echoes of Vana'diel might be none other than Altana, the Dawn Goddess herself. Now, that's especially something I would expect if we get Promethea in, say, the second raids here. Honestly, Shadow Lord, the final boss of the first one, Promethea, the final boss of the second one, and then Altana, the final boss of the third one. To me, that almost makes sense given what those characters mean in the individual story, and that they are very iconic within Final Fantasy XI itself. That might mean dealing with the emptiness, which you may recognize some of the emptiness creatures from 11 as they're actually on the moon in 14. So, again, there's some room for some overlap here. It's really going to depend how it's written, though, because the term Echoes of Vana'diel could also have another meaning for the story itself. I talked about how it could be a shard, but it could also be literally one of the earliest civilizations on the planet itself. So, for those who aren't too well aware of the timelines, the Sundering happened 12,000 years ago, and the Allegan Empire crumbled 5,000 years ago. We really don't have much in the way of knowledge or history of anything that happened before the Allegan Empire. We know the different calamities, and we have some bits and bobs and pieces about things that did happen, but we don't really know anything about those eras, like a giant empty space in history to discover. And given echoes of Vana'diel. I mean, the term echo means something very particular in Final Fantasy XIV, but uncovering ancient histories about the planet from eras that have just been forgotten to time, I think is just another way of incorporating it. Not to mention, again, you know, Final Fantasy XI is the MMO senpai at Square Enix. So with it also being over 20 years old, I mean, to me, that seems like a very honorable way to pay homage to the MMO that preceded 14 and make it a piece of the history. Again, not saying 11 becomes 14. I'm not trying to do like a canonicity thing here. I'm saying incorporate it into 14's lore and not, you know what I'm saying? I just want to make that perfectly clear. But I think that's another likely route. And that could, of course, adjust the way the bosses are handled, and any of the various elements could be incorporated. So those are just some of my crackpot theories and boss predictions and all that good stuff. Finally, you have locations and music predictions, and honestly, I'm not super confident about any of the predictions I have in those categories because we're talking about a whole other MMO world. It would be, again, arrogant of me to assume that, yeah, they absolutely have to use this location or that location, because that's just not the case. Even if I've named a boss in my predictions, it doesn't mean that that boss's location in 11 will be a location in the raid. Maybe it could be a passing mention or something like that. We have no idea. That being said, I do want to posit a couple of locations and musical tracks that I expect to hear. In terms of a more lively area, I think the Grand Duchy of Juno is very likely to be one of the locations that shows up. Now, it could be the ruins of this ancient civilization that was called Juno, but this was essentially the game's original central hub for endgame content, and even to this day still has a lot of people in it. The music that it has is iconic. The story beats that happen there are known across the player base, and they have constantly reconnected this location to tons of other endgame events throughout the game's 20+ year history at this point. And that just gives me enough reason to make it one of the predictions. Another location is the Imperial Paradox. This really screams final boss energy, this location, but it is another really iconic location that is used again constantly throughout different stories in the game. It's crazy. I didn't even realize how many different versions of the Imperial Paradox existed until I was going back through some old story stuff more recently, you know, after the Echoes of Vana'diel announcement. But yeah, I think it's a really cool boss arena, and I think that the way it could be used in Final Fantasy XIV and what it could mean in Final Fantasy XIV could be, well, just as interesting. And finally, on the music front, I only have one somewhat confident prediction, and that is the music from the zone, the Sanctuary of Jita. Now, this zone itself really just connects to other more important zones, but the music is, I think most Classic 11 players would agree, one of the most iconic tracks in the game. It's really just a nice, chill background music as you're going through the zone, but it's just beloved by so many old Final Fantasy XI heads like myself. It would be almost disappointing to not have it. And it's one of those things where we definitely want an orchestrion of it for Final Fantasy XIV. So that one's my musical guess at the top of the list. But there's so many other tracks, the classic battle theme from the base game, the BCNM music that shows up when you're fighting bosses in the early portions of the game. And then if there wasn't some of the music tracks I was expecting in Baldesion Arsenal, I would probably predict some of those like Turmoil, and not that they couldn't reuse them. I just would prefer them to use more original tracks than to go back and use things they've already used elsewhere in Final Fantasy XIV. Yeah, I'm fighting through COVID right now to make this video, hence my kind of all over the placeness of it, but I am planning on more focused Final Fantasy XI related videos going over the different stories and lores and things that may have effect, especially once we do get that proper key art. I think there's going to be a lot to say once that comes around, and I'm going to be streaming some 11 over the next several months, probably revisiting some of the old stories. I'm actually trying to finish the Voracious Resurgence, the most recent story right now, so yeah, that's just what's on the docket for me in Final Fantasy XI on this channel, and hopefully those of you who haven't played it can learn a little bit more about it through me if you don't plan on playing it yourself. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap for this video. Probably shouldn't even be recording it while I'm on COVID, but you know me, I can't help myself. I gotta make the content. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more on Final Fantasy XIV's upcoming expansion, Dawn Trail. Oh, and 6.51, which is going to have new variant criteria and all that good stuff. So anyway, I'll see you all in the next one. And until then, take care.